Our first great operatic composer, Claudio Monteverdi, is credited with observing that it is contraries that most greatly move our minds. More colourfully, a teacher once claimed to my class that the image of a naked human form is not obscene, but one of a naked form on roller skates in a top hat probably is. He was echoing Monteverdi in giving credit to contrast, to disparity, for the raw impact of much artistic expression, however much he decried the attendant vulgarity. Everyone's familiar with the function of surface contrast or shock in music, whether it's what someone on Radio 2 called Key Change Wednesday when a song moves up a key for the chorus, the faux naive appearance of a folk song in a Mahler symphony, or Haydn's sudden chord that puts the va-va-voom into his surprise symphony. What gets less attention in music, meanwhile, is the wider cultural framework, without which any degree of contrast, and indeed expression itself, risks losing meaning. Another word for this framework is style, a concept that's vague to the point of being a bit of a yawn for most of us away from the catwalk. Yet the mainstream of an art enjoyed by millions only makes sense because we employ a sense of style to decode it. Once we find ourselves without those codes, say when we hear music from a culture entirely remote to us, our notions of surprise and expectation cannot operate. We can only pick up the contours of humour in a language that we speak. Within that familiar discourse, these contours reveal for us a typical landscape, stuff that stands out against other stuff that behaves as we expect. Style codes help us distinguish a Miles Davis solo from the basic tune. They tell us that the final high note in Nessun Dorma is climactic. They translate Beethoven's umpteen final chords into his gesture of beetle-browed symphonic closure, and so on. This in turn allows composers to play games with these assumptions, as when Haydn lobs in a false ending to a string quartet. In the words of musicologist Leonard B. Meyer in Music, the Arts and Ideas, as we listen we make predictions, albeit subconscious ones, about where the music is going and how it will get there. Of course, our predictions may not be correct. Our clapping duly bursts upon those final chords, if sometimes at the wrong place, because of style, over and above individual knowledge. Music sports its uniform as proudly as a footballer in a shirt, and we cheer in recognition as it marches by. Or we did. What's happened? Too much hair has been pulled out over the dwindling of audience ownership for the new music of our time, an issue of overwhelming concern to composers like me. But the argument always dwells on difficulties of content. So here's a thought about style and why we need it. Maybe it's not just the difficulty of the moves our music makes, or its exploratory sounds post-Stravinsky, that disturbs us. Maybe it's the lack of a stylistic embrace to contain those things. If no one recognises any team shirts, nobody cheers. Stylistic bounds in a society's art are, like its fashion practices, fluid, negotiable, and a source of frisson when taboos are violated, but we do rely on them. Some of my deepest joys in listening to favourite masterpieces from the musical past spring from a particular wonder. How could this composer step outside everything I know to be what he does, and do that? It is the stuff of deliciously raised eyebrows. I was listening in the car to Mozart's Symphony No. 40, music I imbibed in childhood, only to gasp at a raunchy bit in the first movement when a bass line worthy of Charles Mingus breaks out beneath the melodic surface. It cannot be Mozart, yet it is. I've had the same experience from, Brahms' Violin Concerto, Bach, of course, the Beatles, but not, I have to say, in the music of my peers among composers since Bartók. In their repertoire, I love and am moved by innumerable timbres, themes, chords, moments, entire arguments, but I rarely experience these as raised eyebrow moments. I ask, how can they do that, rather than, how could they do that? I believe this is because the work of Birtwistle, Carter, Ruders, Ligeti and other composers I value can no longer be defined as a flock, snug in a fold that shelters them, though occasionally exploiting our naive expectations of what they may do. The repertoires of European music of the past, meanwhile, were infinitely variegated, but they were defined by just these flexible, shifting understandings of the bounds around their pastures of expression. As Leonard Meyer put it, what we expect may not occur or may do so at an unexpected time or in an unexpected way. But, whether expected or not, what actually does take place is coloured by the fact that predictions were made. This process, furthermore, is not just the province of the boffin, since, I believe, style serves to point every dedicated listener to a landscape of musical features, including listeners who cannot parse these in technical terms. Our ears alone can pick up striking deviations from the lingua franca. So long as any such framework of expectation exists, it can be stretched or sundered excitingly. But once each work of art has its own territory and private rules, a modern phenomenon that the philosopher Adorno saw as individuation, then nothing can be said to stand outside our expectations. Having heard composer X's piece last week is no preparation for hearing one by composer Y today. For this reason, listeners go into our concerts without expectation, so they cannot be surprised. They can be perplexed, which is not the same thing. Polite listeners' comments to composers about their music that it was interesting are the entirely understandable result of an experience now delivered without the user's manual offered by universal context. That other phrase, "I'd need to hear it again," is near the mark, but what the listener should be saying is, "I'd need to hear something else that conditioned how you write." Now that would be useful. Whether this lost, orientating sense of style was always a gift of hindsight, I cannot be sure. We know how differently we hear some works now from those audiences who were confounded by their radicalism. So it may be that a sense of style is a map you find when you get home later, though you never manage to take it on the actual walk. In recent times, both Grayson Perry and Stephen Fry have affirmed the need for art to resist the trivial, to maintain its remorseless and sometimes rarefied expression of our condition. I cheer their timely assertion of this, but the question then becomes one of how art delivers that expression in a time of utter pluralism. I do know that frameworks help to move our minds, as they did Monteverdi's, because they can be transgressed. Great things can be somehow contained within them, but, joy of joys, the greatest of these tend to spill out. Stylistic frameworks are a fount of amazement, partly because of when they go wrong. Without the misleading securities of style, we as artists face a yet more daunting expressive challenge in bursting the bounds of the expected. In a different sense, I've come to the conclusion that all composers are captives of style or of historical circumstance, maybe all artists generally. We have no option but to be ourselves given the artistic landscape against which we pop up. Whether in 1600, 1918 or whenever, we are forced to deal with the historical hand we're given, whether reacting against the stile antico like Monteverdi or against late Romanticism like Stravinsky. Like shipwreck victims, we have to make do with what we find lying around. But that whole mapping exercise, when as composers we look around, or as listeners we try to fit a composer into a set of historical coordinates, is facilitated by a landscape of styles, so much so that we take it for granted that we can relate some music we hear to what we know. Now, however, I'm not sure we can map our own new art music in that way, although this may just be because it's now and dust has to settle. Of course, we have numerous types, isms that form stylistic groupings, but that's not the same as an overall sense of artistic behaviour that lights up the way and points up exceptions. In the last 50 years, it's as if the scenery of a play has quietly become three-dimensional, with real doors and exits that lead who knows where. The actors have less ground for certainty than ever about where their entrances fit, or even what their lines are. If style is a lack of real freedom, what Messiaen called the joy of impossibilities, then the corollary, the absence of style in art, feels something like artistic fear of the unknown.